One defining fact, or sorry, feature of any culture is language. Now, I'm not just talking about how one country may speak English and another country may speak Russian and another French and another Portuguese. Language is a thing that within culture that not only helps define a culture, but it also is inherent to identifying cultural members. Okay. Think about it. If there things that you're involved in that involve a language, that involve terms, words, or phrases that people outside of this group, this little subculture that you're in, don't use. And if somebody says, I'm familiar with this subculture, but they can't speak the language, is that going to cause you to raise an eyebrow? Like, are you sure? Okay. So that's a relationship between language and culture. And it also it affects communication style. And what is the preferred style of that culture? And how language works within a culture and how these communication styles differs, well, that is the subject of this video. So as I said, language and communication styles across cultures, how do they work? How do they function? What influences do they have? Well, to get a better understanding of this, we need to start at the beginning, okay? And that means we need to start out talking about this, the semiotic triangle. Now, the semiotic triangle, it's kind of the foundational idea or theory, if you will, for all language and linguistics that really focuses on how language works. And so, in its easiest way, I can explain it as this. What the semiotic triangle says is that in order for a word to be able to be used between people and to be used effectively, the two people in this instance involved in that conversation have to agree on the 3 points of this triangle, on the word, the object, and the definition. Now, what are those? Okay, first, the word. We talked about before, words mean nothing unless we say they do. They are just symbolic representations of stuff that we have agreed to call a certain thing, okay? So you need to know the word. If you're going to look at a cat, you need to know that's a cat. But that's not sufficient. But it's typically the first thing that we learn. Now, a great way to visualize this or to think about it is some of you may have a little brother, sister, niece, nephew, something. I'm talking like little, 2, 3 years old, that is learning to talk. And very often, if you think about these 3 things, the first thing they learn is the word. They'll say spoon. They don't know what a spoon is. First couple times they use it, they just know it's a sound they've heard mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, whatever say, and they replicate it. And when they do, we go, oh, that's what you said, spoon. And they get all goosey with them. We make them happy. So they say it again. They know the word, they don't know what it stands for. Okay. But then you get the object. This is what the word stands for. We also call this the referent. Now, for every single word that you know, and you probably haven't thought about this, and buried somewhere deep in your subconscious is the actual picture, if you will, of the original object that you associated that word with. Okay? That spoon was this. For my daughter, when she was saying spoon, it was her blue and yellow bubble guppy spoon. That to her was spoon. Now, here's the thing. She knew the word and she now had an object, a referent that it stood for, but she didn't know the broader definition. So in her mind, when she'd be in her high chair and she'd be like, spoon, if we handed her any other spoon other than her blue and yellow bubble guppy spoon, what do you think she did? Those of you that experience this know. She was like, spoon. We're handing her like her strawberry shortcake red and pink spoon, but it's not spoon to her because she just associates it with this one example. Okay, and it's that way for everything. We all in our brains have this initial picture of the initial object we attach the word to. So how are we able to use it? Well, that's because we learned the definition. Eventually, my daughter learned that a spoon, yes, the blue and yellow bubble guppy was an example of it, but a spoon was something with a handle, has a dip that you can eat with. And once she learned that, then we can hand her any of the spoons and she'd be fine. But she had to know that definition. So in order for communication to effectively happen between two people, those two people have to agree on the word, the object, and the definition. Okay, you may have experienced trying to have a conversation before with somebody who didn't have this, When I was in college, I worked at Walmart and I worked in the garden center, but we were right next to the hardware section. And I can't even tell you the number of times, and some of you that work in retail may have had this experience, where somebody would come in and they would say something like, yeah, I'm looking for the doohickey or the thingamajig that does this. I'm looking for the doohickey in the back of the toilet to make the water go up and down. Okay, they knew what it looked like and they could describe what it did. They had a definition, but they didn't know the word. All right? That was why it was thingamajiggy or doohickey. I know what a carburetor is in a car. I know the word. I know what a carburetor does. I can't identify one. If you opened the hood and said, where's the carburetor? I have no clue. I don't know what it looks like. I don't have the object. So you've got to get all three of these in any language for it to be effective. Which is kind of funny because, now look, y'all, I've been to several different countries, both on vacation or growing up or in the military. This is not an American thing. This is not a Eastern or Western thing. This is a human being thing. What do you think tends to be, and the most basic example is, you ever had to try to have a conversation with somebody that does not speak the same language as you? What tends to be our first reaction when confronted with somebody that we need to talk to that doesn't speak our language? Maybe thinking, well, we use gestures. That's second. The most common first response is we try to talk louder and slower. Like somehow that's going to overcome a lack of consistency in word, object, or definition. But it's what we tend to do as human beings, and that doesn't work. And then when it doesn't work, then we tend to like start using gestures and whatnot to try to get our point across. But you need to understand this is how language works and functions, and you have to have this agreement, and you need to understand this because it plays into how cultures view and interpret things and why you may have different words, even within the same English-speaking cultures, different words for different things. So you also need to understand that there is an intrinsic relationship between language and power. Okay. Now, one of the first theories that came about that really illustrated this is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis by Dr. Sapir and Dr. Whorf. And what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically says is your language influences how you interpret the world, that you interpret the world through language. And as such, all language is a filter by which you see, analyze, and make sense of the world around you. Okay? And the example of this, or one of the examples that they talk about in their work, is they were doing a cultural ethnography. So when you go out with a culture and you observe it and look at it and observe it, see what's happening. But they were doing cultural ethnography research on an Inuit tribe that lived in northern Alaska and northern Canada, out on the Arctic. And what they found, and I want you to think about this, in the native language of this tribe, they did not have a word in their language for the first person possessive. Okay, words like this is mine, they had no word for mine. Everything was ours. Didn't even really have a word for I. It was all plural. It was all we, because they were a very communal society. Now, think about that. If you don't have a word in your language for like mine or I, how in the world can I try to explain to you individual property? You don't have a word for it. How can I explain individual rights? There's no word for it. Another example they don't talk about, but I've heard this explained before, is imagine if you met somebody who was blind from birth and they asked you, what does the color blue look like? What would you tell them? You can't say, well, it's the color of the sky. They're blind since birth. They've never seen the sky. And if you could think of it, how would you differentiate blue from indigo? Get the point? So it's how we see our culture. It's how we see our world. So the language that you come up through and that you learn is going to come with value orientations and whatnot that are going to shape how you see things, okay? Because that's how you make sense of the world, and language is a filter for that. And this also goes to this idea of the power of labels. I know it's got a little dicey, with it just being PC and all this, but this research has been around way before any of that stuff. that basically says the labels we have and we give to people affect how we view them, affect how we treat them. Okay. Like, how many of you can think of some kid that maybe you grew up with that maybe in first or second grade got labeled by one teacher the bad kid? And then that teacher is having lunch with another teacher that teaches at a grade above them, and he or she tells that teacher, "Man, I hope you don't get so and so. That kid's a bad kid." And that other teacher gets them the next year, and they're like, "Oh, that's a bad kid because and then they start treating them that way. All right. How you label things, what you call them, is a big deal. Not just in a negative sense, but in an overall sense as well. For example, in the world of product marketing, the holy grail in product marketing is for the name of your product to become a synonym for the product category. Okay? Example. Would you say, I'm going to go make a photocopy or I'm going to Xerox it? No, it's not as big in the day, but forever people just called them Xerox. Xerox is not what it's called, a photocopy, but Xerox made it. They were the first company to do it, and therefore it became a synonym for this. Same thing. You probably are all familiar with these. Now this is an adhesive piece of paper. It's an adhesive paper, but we call it a Post-it note. That's not the name of what this is. It's adhesive paper, but Mead Paper calls this, they came up with the idea, a Post-it note, and therefore the name Post-it note has become synonymous with this, even if it's not an actual Post-it from Mead Paper. I told you all in previous videos, I grew up in the Southeast, and I went to college in Georgia, and in Georgia, every soda is a Coke. You go to a restaurant, waiter, waitress comes up, what would you like to drink? I'd like a Coke. The next question they're going to ask is, what kind? And you'll hear, I want a Coke. What kind? Mountain Dew. Because Coke is just synonymous with a soda. Okay, that's what we mean. The most recent product that really did this that I can think of is back, in the 2000s, later part of the 2000s, was Apple with the iPod. You didn't hear people saying, I want an MP3 player. It was, I want an iPod. Because again, the product name of the individual product became synonymous with the whole product category. And what kind of power do you think it gives that company with that product if the whole product category is called by their product name? See how that would give them a lot of power, influence, make their marketing easier? So that's what we mean by power of labels, both positively and negatively. Language also affects our communication style and what is the preferred communication style of our culture. And we've talked before, there's several different reasons why this occurs, history, identity, so forth. But there are some distinct differences. And the first one is high context versus low context. Now, what's the difference here? Okay. Now, these are not, all of these, there's three of these I'm going to go over. I want you to remember, these are not static categories. You are not either high or low. They're opposite ends of a sliding scale, okay? You can be like a level 2 low or a level 4 high, okay? But essentially, if you look at the extremes, there's a way to differentiate them. In a high context communication style culture, what is actually being said is not nearly as important as all the contextual things that go along with it, such as the tone you use, your body posture when you say it, what the environment is in, when environmental factors are there. It's all about the context. Whereas a low context culture, you might think they're more blunt. I say this is what I mean. And again, one of these is not better than the other. They're just different. In a classic example, we in America tend to be more on the low context, but an example of a country that's more high context, for example, is Japan. A lot goes in with context in Japan. I mean, you say thank you by either going domo, domo arigato, or domo arigato gozaimasu. Okay, there's three different ways to say thank you. The difference is context. What is the context here? Which one should you use based on the context between you and the person you're thanking? So you would make that decision based on that. Another example of this dealing with Japan, I remember when I was going to college taking business classes, we learned about this. A big part of doing business in Japan is gift giving. You go there, you meet the company, You talk for a bit, have lunch, dinner. You're supposed to send them a gift afterwards. And what I've always found interesting was, and this is endemic of a high context culture, what the gift is wasn't nearly as important as how elaborate the wrapping was. You could send them beef jerky, but if it's in a nice box with a big bow and it's very intricate and ornate, that's really going to be impressive. Now, for us, if you got a really big elaborate package for Christmas and you opened it up and it was a pair of socks, would you be ecstatic? No, you don't care about the packaging. That's more of a low context thing. So again, high, low context, is it more blunt or all these other things involved? This is very similar to direct versus indirect. In direct, you say what you mean and you mean what you say. Whereas in indirect, you talk around things. More things are hinted at or implied. More things are left to interpretation. You tend to find more indirect styles in countries, cultures where offense is a big deal. Okay? Because if I'm being indirect, it is more difficult to prove I offended you. You might have took it that way, but that's not how I meant it. I meant it like this in this very indirect style. Whereas direct, it's more blunt, up in your face. Even in the United States, in general, New England, New York City is considered to be very blunt, very direct. Whereas I grew up in the South, it tends to be more indirect. That's why people from the South will say, for example, people from New York are rude. And people from New York will say people in the South don't tell the truth. And it's all about this direct versus indirect style. And similar to this as well is elaborate versus understated. Okay, an elaborate style of communication is going to favor very detailed examples, flowery language, lots of use of metaphors and analogies. Some examples of this would be a lot of Asian basin countries, a lot of Native American tribes, whereas the understated style, again, tends to be more blunt. I think an example your book uses is the Amish that tend to just be, this is what it is, boom, done. Okay. So that's what these are. And you can see these are all differences here in what type of communication is viewed appropriate. So this may give you a better understanding as to why, if you come from one area of the country and you go to a different area, you might be viewed as rude, and you're not trying to be rude. It's just the style where you're from is different than the style where you're then at. Okay. So something to think about. Now, when you are in these different areas and you have to communicate across these different cultures, what are some strategies that you can apply? Well, there's all kinds of ones, but they basically fall into three big groups. And this is called code switching. All right. When you sometimes talk this way, but then in these other cases, you talk this way, that's code switching. Okay. For example, you ever, when you were a kid, you were going someplace and your mom and dad might have looked at you and said, now you be on your best behavior. And so you deliberately started acting and talking in a different way than you normally would. That's code switching. And it's not a bad thing. It's a normal thing, and we all do it. How you talk with your friends is probably different than how you talk with your boss. It's normal. It's something we all need to do, and this is just a skill you have to develop. And so, like I said, these strategies fall into three categories. And the first one is what's called assimilation. When you adopt an assimilation strategy, for lack of a better way of putting it, you go all in and trying to act and talk like the culture wherever you're at. Okay? You don't speak a lick of Italian, but you go on vacation to Italy. If you're going to assimilate, you would try your darndest to learn Italian, to only speak Italian while you're there. Maybe dress like an Italian person, whatever fashion's popular at the time. That's assimilation. Okay. And this isn't a bad thing. Again, you got to get out of the mindset this is bad or good. When I was in the military, and I mentioned this before, part of going through boot camp was to assimilate me into the Marine Corps culture. So I would call things and use language that Marines use. I think some of the examples I might have used before is they call a pencil an ink stick and a pen a pencil is a lead stick and a pen is an ink stick. Tennis shoes are called Go Fasters. A flashlight's called a moonbeam. And this is pounded into you in boot camp because they want you to assimilate. They want you to walk, talk, act like a Marine in this model that they've created. And so that's assimilation. Now, there's also accommodation. Accommodation is you're not assimilating fully, But it's like, okay, I'll call it this and this. I think it's weird, and when I'm around you, I ain't going to just call it that, but I'll call it when I'm around you. You accommodate the differences. It's kind of a give and take. Kind of let it be known. Look, I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z, but I will do A, B, and C. Okay. A great example of this, at least from my experience, is have you ever heard of what's called Spanglish? And when I was in the military and I had friends who were Hispanic, they did this a lot where they would speak to each other and they would flow in and out of English and Spanish. They'd be like, man, I got to go to the baño. Baño is bathroom. So, I got to go. And then they throw in a Spanish word. Or, man, I can't find my shirt. What color is it? Verde. That's green. They'd mix in the two. They wouldn't all speak English or all Spanish. They would combine them and kind of fluid and use them together. That's the accommodation style here. You take some, but you reject others. It's kind of like, look, I'll meet you halfway. I'm not going to give up where I'm from, but I'll try to fit in a little bit. But understand there's some things I ain't going to do. That's that accommodation style. Then there's the separation style. This is the I'm not going to change. And I'm not going to change. I will sometimes even physically separate myself from the rest of you all because we are this way and we're not going to assimilate. I'm not going to accommodate. We're going to be this way. If you want to be around us, you're going to do it this way. I'm not changing to you. Classic example, the Amish. They literally separate themselves. They have their own way of doing things. They don't want to integrate, not going to integrate. That's how they are. You also tend to find this in larger cities where you may have Chinatown or Little Italy or Little Ireland, or like in Miami, they have Little Havana. These communities that are pretty much a little microcosm, whatever host country they come from. They're not trying to assimilate or accommodate. It's like, if you come here, this is how we're going to be. And we're going to stay in this little bubble. And again, it presents, there's strengths and weaknesses to this. Again, I know I talk about the military a lot, but admittedly, it's the time in my life when I've been around the most diverse group of people. And I had several friends from Florida, from Miami, who would talk about, yeah, it's good because you know about your culture and it's where you come from and it's a big thing. The problem is if you don't learn to speak English, you can have a job and do well as long as you stay in Little Havana. But if you want to relocate from Little Havana in Miami to Maine, that's not going to work. So it has both positives and negatives, but these are the strategies that you can use for this. So again, language, it's foundational to who we are. It's how we communicate at a fundamental level, and it's how we make sense of the world. And a lot of not only the language we use, but the things you don't think about, the rules that govern it, a lot of those are a byproduct of culture. So here again, language foundational to culture. They're often intrinsically linked to how the culture views things because it's how we make sense of the world and it's how we interact with each other. And very often when we have conflicts between cultures, now not always, sometimes they are deliberate, but other times it's just because these communication differences. I say one thing, but you interpret it to mean something else that I didn't mean, but because maybe I'm high context, you're low context, or I'm indirect and you're direct, that can lead to those problems. So then again, next time you're confronted with a culture that you're not familiar with, for lack of a better way of putting it, try to read the room a bit and see what some of these differences may be. And you just might be surprised that what those differences are. I'm not going to tell you what strategy to use. Maybe you're going to I don't want to do this, but maybe it might give you at least some insight into how that culture thinks and operates. And as always, hope you got something out of this, and I'll see you again in the next video.